Hello everyone, welcome back to the series of lectures on Introduction to DBMS. So that we have understood what is the overall idea of the ER model and the symbols used in the ER diagrams as seen in the previous video. So let us study about each of the building blocks of the ER diagram one by one. We will start with the most important symbol of the ER diagram, the entity type, and we will also understand the definition and its types. So before understanding an entity type, we first need to understand a simpler term which is called the entity. So entity is simply a real world object. So it can be a person, it can be a place, it can be a thing or any event. So about which we want to store the information in the database. For example, a student in the college is an entity. A bus in the transportation system is an entity. Similarly, the computer science department in the college is an entity. A teacher like me is an entity, or subject like DBMS can be an entity. All these things are entities because we want to store information about them. Now comes the important question, what is the difference between entity and entity type? So many students, they get confused over here, but it is actually very simple. Think about a classroom. Suppose there are around 60 students which are sitting in your classroom. So every individual student is an entity. But when we say student as a whole, we are referring to the entity type, which represents the entire category or the collection of the students. So remember, this is very simple rule that entity is one specific object, but entity type is the collection of that category of similar entities. So let me give another example. Suppose we have a bus number 101. So it is one entity. Then we have bus number 102. It is an entity. Bus number 103. It can be an entity. But together, these buses will be called as the entity type. Same idea goes to the department also. We have the computer science engineering department. We have the mechanical department, or we have the civil department. So all these departments together, they will be an entity type. Now look at the figure here. So the entity type is represented with the help of rectangle. So whenever you see a rectangle, then you immediately think that it is an entity type. So here you see student is an entity type, bus is an entity type, and department is an entity type. So database is actually organized around the entity types. So why is it so? Because when we actually implement the database, every entity type, it becomes a table. So we'll study about the conversion from the ER model to the relational model. There the things will become clearer. The student entity type will become student table. Similarly, the bus entity type will become bus table, and department entity type will become the department table. So this is one of the most important points that you need to remember. So let us understand the student example over here. So what information do we want to store about every student? So we want to store the student number, the gender, the name or their phone number, email ID, etc. So these pieces of information, they describe the student, and in the ER diagram, we call them attributes. So we will study about attributes in the next lecture in detail. So for now, just understand that every entity type, they contain certain properties, and these properties are called the attributes. Now let's see what is the difference between entity and a table. So as I have said that the student entity type will become a table. So look at the example at the bottom right. So here we have a student table. So the student entity type has become the database table called as the student table. Each of these rows in the student table, they are the entities, and you see that the collection of these entities is called the entity type. So now that when we understand what entity type is, so let me clarify one more point. It is very important and it creates confusion among the students that in many books, tutorials, and even in classroom discussions, so our faculties or the people, they casually use the word entity in explaining the ER diagram. So they actually use the word entity in the ER diagram. So actually it is entity type. So this distinction is very small, but it is very important. So let's understand with an example. Suppose we draw a rectangle and it is labeled as student. Does this rectangle, it represent one student? For example, my name is Souvik and my roll number is 301 and my phone number is suppose something something and my gender is male. So there can be another student called Nikki with some phone number and she is female. So she is another entity and together many such entities will combine together to form the student table. So just remember one simple comparison that entity type is just like a class or a category and entity is one specific member in that category. So you can also compare it with programming also. So a class defines what? A structure, while an object is actually the instance of that class. So similarly, so student is an entity type, but Souvik or Nikki or Rahul or Priya or even Amit is entity. So that is why in ER diagram, every rectangle, it represents what? Entity type, not one individual entity. So however, since everyone understands the meaning from the context, so many book simply they say entity instead of entity type. So don't get confused. So even when you hear both of these terms, just remember the technical difference. So now that when we have understood what entity type is, so let's move on to the another important classification. So not all the entity types, they are the same. So some can exist independently while the other, they are dependent on the another entity type. So this creates the classification of the entity type into strong entity type and the weak entity type. A strong entity type is an entity type which can exist independently. So it does not depend on the other entity. It has its own primary key. That is very important to know because it uniquely identifies each entity in the table. For example, consider a student entity. So here the student ID will be the primary key and it will be helping to uniquely define every row in the student table. So even if there is no result record or course record, the student will exist. Similarly, we have the employee or the book or the department or the customer. So all these are the strong entities. In ER diagram, a strong entity is represented by using a single rectangle. So you can see it over here in the diagram. But when we move to the weak entity type, these cannot exist independently and they depend on the strong entities. Also, it does not have a complete primary key of its own. So instead, it identifies every tuple using its own partial key and the primary key of the parent entity or the strong entity on which it depends. So in the ER diagram, you can see a weak entity type is represented by double rectangle as shown over here, and a strong entity type is represented with a single rectangle. One more important thing is you can see the identifying relationship. So it is represented using a double diamond. We will study about this later when we will study about the relationship. So let me explain this diagram in detail. A student is a strong entity type over here. A student can exist independently. Now look at the result. So can this result exist without a student? Of course not. So every result must belong to at least some student. The student data is deleted, automatically the result data won't exist. So the corresponding result record will also lose its meaning. Therefore, result is here the weak entity type. And you can see here we are using a double rectangle to represent the result. So the relationship connecting them is also shown using the double diamond, so indicating as the identifying relationship. So once again, I want to say that the result may have information like subject or marks or the grade or the semester, but all these details, they become meaningless without the student entity type. So you can quickly summarize the difference using the table shown over here. So a strong entity type can exist independently. It has its own primary key and it is represented by single rectangle. While a weak entity, it depends on the another entity. It does not have a complete primary key and it is represented by double rectangle. If strong entity is deleted, the weak entity generally is deleted as well because it cannot exist independently. Now, this idea may still remain a little abstract, so let's understand it using some database table. So let's verify our understanding using a real database example. So at the bottom slide, you can see the result table. So here you have the student table. It has its own primary key called the SID. It has department and student name. But the student, it can exist independently. So this entity type, when you convert it into a table called the student table, you represent it like this. So SID becomes the prime attribute, and then we have the another attributes without underline, you can see over here. So here 101 CSE ABC is one entity and 102 CSE XYZ is another entity. So together they are under the umbrella of the student entity type. And this is a strong entity type because it has its own key attribute. So in the next slide, you have another part of the ER diagram. So this is basically the part of the result entity type. So when it is converted into the result table, so you can see here we have the student ID and we have the subject. So together they form the key, and you see here we use the partial key, which is the subject over here, attribute subject using dotted line. It is the partial key and it is assisted by the primary key of the strong entity type. So here you see the SID is taken from the student entity type and together they form the key. So suppose a record says SID is equal to 101, subject is mathematics, marks is 35, grade is F and semester is first, then can this result exist without the student ID 101? No. So if there is no student ID 101, this result record becomes meaningless. Similarly, when you see the second record, it depends completely on the student called 102. So this clearly shows that result is always a weak entity type. It cannot exist independently. So thus we come to the end of the video 5. So here we learned about one of the important concepts of ER diagram called as the entity type. We studied the difference between entity and the entity type. And finally, we learned about the classification of the entity type, that is the strong entity type and the weak entity type. So that's all for today. Thank you and have a great day.